Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the small pile of money on the table. 9 crisp $100 bills, carefully folded, were all he had left after years of trying to hold his life together. Once, not long ago, he had a steady job, a comfortable apartment, and the respect of people around him. But the factory where he worked closed down. Bills kept coming, and soon he was drowning in debt. One by one, the little comforts he had worked for slipped out of his hands. First his car, then his furniture, then even his savings account. Now the only thing standing between him and complete emptiness was those 9 bills. He thought carefully about what to do with them. Rent would swallow the money in less than 2 months. Food would use it up in weeks, and even if he stretched it carefully, he knew the money wouldn't last long. He felt as if life had pushed him into a corner and there was no way out. Then one morning, while sitting in a small cafe with a cup of black coffee, he overheard 2 men talking about an auction in the county. They mentioned abandoned land being sold cheaply. Most people weren't interested because the land was run down, forgotten, and overgrown. But to Daniel, their words sounded like a strange kind of hope. He went home that night and thought about it again and again. Could he really use his last $900 to buy something that most people had already given up on? His friends, the few who still checked on him, told him not to do anything foolish. "You need food, Daniel, not empty land," one of them said. Another shook his head and said, "Don't waste the last thing you've got. There's nothing out there but weeds." But Daniel felt a quiet voice inside him pushing him toward the risk. He didn't know why, but he couldn't ignore it. The morning of the auction came, and Daniel walked into the county courthouse with sweaty palms and a pounding heart. He sat in the back of the small room, watching as other buyers lifted their hands to claim properties. Some lots went for thousands of dollars, others for tens of thousands. When the auctioneer announced the abandoned farm on the edge of town, there was almost no interest. The photos showed broken fences, a barn leaning to one side, and a house with missing windows. People shook their heads and most stayed silent. Then Daniel lifted his hand. "Do I hear 900? The auctioneer called, scanning the room. No one else raised their hand. The room went quiet. The gavel came down with a loud crack. "Sold for $900. The auctioneer shouted. Just like that, Daniel had spent every dollar he had on land that others thought was worthless. Some people turned and looked at him with pity, some with curiosity. A man whispered to his friend, "He'll regret it in a week." But Daniel didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt like he had chosen something for himself. When he first stepped onto the farm, the place almost took his breath away. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was so broken. Grass taller than his waist covered the fields, and the dirt road leading to the house was cracked and full of holes. The barn door hung by one hinge, squeaking in the wind. The farmhouse looked tired, its roof sagging and its paint peeling. Daniel stood there with a small bag of clothes and a toolbox, wondering if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. But then he smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "At least it's mine." He dragged his mattress into the corner of the house, set up a small stove, and lit a candle. That night, as he lay in the silence of the old farmhouse, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The air was cold, the walls creaked, but it was his. He had nothing left in his wallet, but he had a piece of land under his feet. The days that followed were hard. Daniel woke up early each morning to clear the weeds with his bare hands and a rusty sickle he had found in the shed. His hands blistered, his back ached, and some nights he fell asleep without eating because he was too tired to cook. Yet every morning he pushed himself to do a little more. He patched broken fences using scrap wood, cleaned the farmhouse window by window, and fixed leaks in the roof with tin sheets he picked up from junkyards. Sometimes neighbors passed by and shook their heads. "That place has been empty for 20 years, one of them said. Another man laughed and told him nothing will grow there. That land is cursed. But Daniel ignored their voices. He believed that the land deserved one more chance, just like he did. One evening, after a long day of cutting grass, Daniel sat on the porch and watched the sun dip behind the hills. His muscles hurt, his stomach growled, but his heart felt strangely light. The land still looked wild and broken, but he could see the beginnings of change. A small patch of earth cleared, a fence standing straighter, a roof that no longer dripped when it rained. He whispered, "Maybe I can bring this place back to life." But life was not easy. Storm clouds rolled in one week, and heavy rain battered the farmhouse. Wind howled through the broken walls of the barn, and Daniel ran out with a hammer and nails to keep the boards from flying away. As he worked in the storm, soaked to the skin, he noticed something strange about the barn floor. The wooden planks creaked under his boots, but some of them made a deeper, hollow sound. He frowned, pressing his foot down again. It felt different, as if there was space beneath. At first, he brushed it off. The barn was old. Of course, the wood would sound strange. But the thought kept tugging at him even as the storm passed. Lying in bed that night, he couldn't stop hearing the sound of those boards echoing in his mind. It was as if the barn itself was trying to tell him something. Daniel turned on his side, staring at the flickering candlelight. He whispered to himself, "What are you hiding under there?" And though he didn't yet know it, that question was the beginning of a discovery that would change his life forever. Daniel woke up the next morning with the sound of birds outside his broken window. The storm had passed and the air felt fresh and clean, but the barn still stood in his mind. He could not shake off the memory of those floorboards. They had sounded hollow, as if something was waiting beneath them. He told himself not to dream too much. Life had taught him to expect little. Still, a small spark of curiosity began to grow in his heart. He walked outside with a mug of hot tea he had brewed on his little stove. The farm looked quiet, almost too quiet, as if it was still asleep. He carried his mug to the barn and pushed the door open. The hinges squealed and the smell of wet hay filled the air. He stepped onto the wooden floor, listening carefully. Some boards groaned in the usual way, but when his foot pressed on the spot he had noticed before, it gave off that strange hollow echo again. Daniel crouched down and tapped on the wood with his knuckles. It was clear something was under there, but he didn't have the tools or the strength yet to pry it open. He sighed, shaking his head. He had work to do if he wanted to survive on this land, and chasing shadows would not put food on his plate. So he left the boards alone, telling himself that maybe one day he would look under them, but for now his focus had to be on making the farm livable. The days turned into weeks. Daniel built his routine. Each morning he rose with the sun, washed his face in cold water from the old pump, and walked out into the field with his tools. He cleared weeds, cut back the tall grass, and tried to prepare the soil for planting. His clothes grew dirty and torn, and his shoes wore thin, but he pressed on. Sometimes, as he worked, people passed by. A woman from a nearby farm brought him a loaf of bread once, saying softly, "You'll need your strength." He thanked her with tears in his eyes. Others only mocked him. "Why waste your energy?" they asked. "That land is useless." But Daniel didn't argue. He had no proof that he could make it work, but he had hope, and hope was all he had left. Every evening when the sun dipped below the horizon, he sat on the porch of the farmhouse and looked out over the fields. Slowly he began to notice small changes. The weeds were thinning, the fences stood taller, and the land no longer looked like it had been forgotten. He even managed to plant a few rows of vegetables. They were small and fragile, but they gave him a reason to smile. Yet despite the progress, life was still hard. Some nights he went to bed hungry. His $900 was long gone, and there was no money left for luxuries. He survived on bread, beans, and whatever small crops he could grow. The house remained cold in the evenings, and the roof leaked whenever it rained. He patched it again and again, but there was only so much he could do with scraps in his bare hands. Still, Daniel kept working. He told himself each day that the farm was like him, broken, worn, but not beyond repair. He believed that with time, patience, and effort, both he and the land would heal together. One afternoon, while repairing the side of the barn, he stopped to rest and leaned against the wall. His eyes drifted back to the floorboards inside. That old curiosity returned, stronger than before. He remembered the hollow sound, the strange echo beneath his feet. "What if there's something under there?" he whispered. "What if the land has a secret?" He pushed the thought away and returned to work, but the idea never left him. Every time he entered the barn, his eyes went to that one spot on the floor. It was as if the boards were calling to him. The nights were the hardest. Lying on his mattress in the farmhouse, listening to the wind outside, Daniel often thought about his past. He remembered the day he lost his job, the look on his boss's face, the empty silence when he came home to his apartment. He remembered selling his car, selling his belongings, shrinking his life down piece by piece until there was almost nothing left. Sometimes he wondered if buying the farm had been foolish, but when he thought of giving up, he reminded himself that at least here he had a chance. As the weeks passed, he poured his heart into the land. He patched the barn roof, repaired the windows, and even managed to build a small chicken coop with scrap wood. He had no chickens yet, but he dreamed of hearing their clucks one day. Neighbors began to notice. Some stopped mocking him. They saw the farmhouse slowly changing, the land looking less like a jungle and more like a field. A few even offered small help. A handful of seeds, a bundle of hay, an old tool they no longer used. Daniel accepted each gift with gratitude, storing them carefully. But still, the mystery of the barn floor lingered. The more progress he made outside, the stronger the pull inside became. It was like an unfinished story waiting for its next chapter. One evening, after a long day of planting, Daniel finally decided he couldn't wait any longer. He took his hammer, walked into the barn, and stood over the suspicious boards. The air felt heavy, as if the barn itself was holding its breath. He pressed his foot down and listened to the hollow sound echo beneath him. His heart pounded in his chest. Slowly, he slid the hammer under the edge of a board and pushed. The wood groaned, resisting at first, then gave way with a crack. Dust rose into the air and a small gap appeared. He widened it, his hands shaking until he could see the dark space beneath. What he saw made him freeze. It wasn't just empty dirt under there. There was something else, something hidden. He dropped the hammer and crouched lower, peering into the shadows. His eyes widened as the outline of a box came into view. Old, rusted, and covered in dust, but unmistakably a box. His breath caught. He whispered, almost afraid to believe it. "What are you doing here?" Daniel sat back on his heels, trembling. All at once, the exhaustion of weeks of work vanished, replaced by a rush of adrenaline. He had no idea what the box contained, but one thing was certain. It had been waiting there for years, maybe decades buried in silence, and now, with his hands dirty and his heart racing, Daniel knew that his life was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. Daniel could not take his eyes off the box lying in the shadow beneath the barn floor. His hands trembled as he reached into the gap and brushed away the dust that clung to the wood. The box was heavy, too heavy to lift out with one hand, so he pulled back more floorboards until the opening was wide enough. With a grunt, he dragged the box out into the middle of the barn. Dust rose around him in small clouds, and the old hinges of the lid groaned when he touched them. For a moment, he just sat there staring at it. His mind spun with questions. Who had put it there? How long had it been hidden? Was it full of junk, or was it something valuable? The lock was rusty, but still strong. He tried pulling at it, but it didn't budge. He went back to the farmhouse, grabbed his hammer and an old chisel, and returned. Every hit sent echoes through the barn until finally, with one last strike, the lock gave way. Daniel held his breath as he slowly lifted the lid. The hinges creaked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, at first, he only saw darkness and the smell of old paper. Then his eyes adjusted and he saw stacks of envelopes tied with string, rolls of yellowed documents, and something that made his heart stop. Bundles of cash neatly wrapped, untouched by time. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, and stared again. It was real. He wasn't dreaming. His hands shook as he picked up one bundle, flipping through the bills. They were genuine. Dozens, maybe hundreds, and that was only the top layer. Beneath the cash were jars of old coins, their metal gleaming faintly in the dim barn light. Daniel's chest tightened. He sank to the floor, holding the money with both hands, his heart pounding so fast it almost hurt. Tears welled up in his eyes. For years he had lived with so little, scraping by, cutting corners, going to bed hungry. And now this treasure was lying in his lap. He didn't move for a long time. His mind wandered back to the struggles of the past months. Nights when he had shivered in the cold farmhouse, days when his stomach ached from hunger, mornings when he questioned if buying the land had been a mistake. And now, here in the same barn where he had fought against despair, he was staring at something that could change everything. After some time, he carefully closed the lid again and pulled the box close. He didn't want anyone to see it, not yet. He knew the neighbors sometimes stopped by, and news like this would spread faster than fire. He needed time to think, to understand what he had found. That night, he carried a few bundles of cash back into the farmhouse, keeping them hidden under his mattress. He lit a candle and opened one of the old envelopes. Inside was a letter written in shaky handwriting. It seemed to be from the farm's previous owner, a man whose name Daniel had seen on the auction papers. The letter spoke of hard times, of saving every dollar and of hiding the savings in the barn for safety. The man had written that he hoped one day his land would be cared for again, that someone would love it as much as he once did. Daniel sat with the letter in his hand, tears sliding down his cheeks. It felt as though fate had connected him to this land, as though he had been chosen not just to survive but to restore what had been forgotten. The money wasn't just cash, it was a gift, a second chance, a voice from the past saying, "Keep going." The next day he returned to the barn and carefully went through more of the box. He found more coins, some of them rare and shining even after years in the dark. There were deeds, certificates, and small notes tucked between the bundles of money. It was clear that whoever had hidden this fortune had done so with care, almost as if preparing it for someone who would come later. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a deep sense of security. He didn't have to worry about his next meal. He didn't have to wonder if the farm would collapse around him. He had the means now to repair, rebuild, and dream. But more than the money itself, what brought him to tears was the timing. He had been on the edge of giving up, yet the land had answered him in the most unexpected way. That evening, he cooked himself a warm meal, something better than he had eaten in months. As he ate, he kept glancing at the letter from the old owner. He felt as though he had been trusted with a responsibility, not just a fortune. He whispered into the quiet room, "I won't waste this. I promise." Over the following days, Daniel began to plan. He didn't rush to the bank or tell anyone about his discovery. Instead, he carefully cleaned and sorted what he had found. He counted the cash slowly, bundle by bundle, until the number left him breathless. It was far more than he had ever dreamed. The coins, too, were valuable. He could tell by their weight and shine, though he didn't yet know their exact worth, but Daniel was not thinking only of himself. He thought about the farm, about the community that had once given up on this land, and about the people who had shown him kindness when he had nothing. The fortune could give him more than comfort, it could give him purpose. At night, when the world was quiet, he lay on his mattress and thought of all the possibilities. He could fix the farmhouse, make it warm and safe. He could restore the barn, plant real crops, raise animals, and bring the land back to life. And perhaps when the time was right, he could help others too. Still, the discovery weighed on him. He knew money could change people. If the wrong eyes found out, envy and greed could destroy the peace he had found. So Daniel kept his secret close to his heart, guarding it carefully even as his dreams began to grow. The barn, once a place of broken boards and silence, had become something sacred. Every time he stepped inside now, he felt the weight of history pressing gently on his shoulders. It was no longer just wood and nails. It was the keeper of a miracle. And deep inside, Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The box had given him hope, but what he chose to do with it, that would define the rest of his story. Daniel woke up the next morning with a strange mixture of joy and fear. The box was real, the money was real, and the letter was real. He had touched it, counted it, and held it in his trembling hands. Yet the thought of what to do next kept him restless. He walked outside, breathing in the cool air, and stared at the land. The farm still looked broken, fences bent, fields rough, and the house tired. But now he saw it with new eyes. He no longer felt like a man trapped by hopelessness. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a new beginning. He began by repairing the farmhouse. With some of the money, he bought tools, nails, and wood from the nearest town. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow when Daniel walked in with cash. "Didn't think you had much left after buying that farm," the man said. Daniel only smiled and said, "I'm not done yet." Piece by piece, he replaced the broken windows, fixed the roof, and patched the holes in the walls. For the first time in months, the house began to feel like a home. At night, when the rain came, he sat inside by the fire and listened with relief as the roof held steady. Then he turned to the land. He bought seeds, corn, beans, and tomatoes, and began planting with care. His hands, once blistered and weak, grew strong from the work. Each day he watered the soil, removed weeds, and prayed for growth. Neighbors passing by started to notice. "The place looks different," one said. Another whispered, "He's really bringing it back." Some even offered to help, though they had once laughed at him. Daniel didn't tell them about the box. To everyone else, it seemed like he was simply working hard and getting lucky. But inside, he carried the secret close to his heart. Every time he entered the barn, he touched the box and whispered, "Thank you." It was his reminder that miracles existed in the most unlikely places. Weeks passed, and the vegetables began to sprout. Tiny green shoots broke through the soil, reaching for the sun. Daniel smiled each time he saw them. They were small, but they were alive, just like his dream. Soon he used more of the money to buy chickens, then goats, and finally a cow. The farm, once silent and empty, now echoed with life. Clucks, bleats, and the steady rhythm of hooves on the ground. One evening, Daniel sat on the porch as the sun set behind the hills. He looked out at the fields, the animals, and the repaired barn. Tears filled his eyes. He remembered the days when he had gone hungry, the nights when he had shivered in the dark, and the hopeless mornings when he almost gave up. Now he had food, warmth, and a reason to wake up each day. He whispered into the golden light, "I thought I was lost, but you gave me a second chance." The more the farm grew, the more Daniel thought of others. He remembered the woman who had once given him bread when he had nothing. He remembered the kind neighbors who shared tools and seeds. He also remembered the families in the community who were still struggling, just as he once had. Slowly he began to share. He gave vegetables to families with children, eggs to the elderly, and even hired 2 young men from the town to help him on the farm. "Work with me," he told them. "Let's bring this land back together." People began to talk about him in a new way. They no longer saw him as the desperate man who had wasted his last $900. They saw him as a symbol of hope. His story spread, and soon others came to see the farm that had risen from nothing. Some called it luck, others called it fate, but Daniel knew it was something more. It was a gift he had been trusted to use wisely. The box remained hidden in the barn, untouched except for the times Daniel checked on it. He didn't spend it carelessly. He only used what was needed to repair, to plant, to build, and to help others. The rest stayed safe, waiting. Every time he looked at it, he felt tears welling in his eyes. Not because of greed, but because he knew how much it had changed him. He was no longer the broken man who walked into the auction with sweaty palms. He was no longer the man mocked for buying abandoned land. He was a man with purpose, a man with faith in life again. One day, a group of children came to the farm on a school visit. Their teacher had told them Daniel's story, that he had bought land everyone thought was worthless and turned it into something alive again. The children ran through the fields, fed the chickens, and laughed under the warm sun. Watching them, Daniel's chest filled with a feeling he couldn't describe. This was more than a farm now. It was a place of joy, of learning, of second chances. At night, when everyone was gone and the farm was quiet again, Daniel sat alone in the barn. He placed his hand on the old wooden box and whispered, "You didn't just give me money. You gave me back my life." The tears came freely, not of sadness but of gratitude. From then on, Daniel worked not just for himself, but for the community. He used some of the fortune to repair the old well in the village, so families had clean water again. He donated quietly to the school, making sure children had books and supplies. He never told anyone where the money came from. He didn't need to. All that mattered was that it was used for good. The farm became known as a place where no one was turned away hungry. Travelers passing through were offered a warm meal. Neighbors found work and dignity. Children laughed in the fields. Daniel had taken what was hidden in the dark and used it to bring light. As he stood in the barn one evening, the setting sun painting everything gold, he realized something important. The true fortune was not the money itself, but the chance to live with meaning. The tears in his eyes weren't just for what he had found, but for what he had become. He had been a man at the edge of despair, ready to lose everything. Now he was a man with hope, a man with a purpose, a man who had discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures are not hidden in the ground, but awakened in the heart. Daniel woke up early one morning to the sound of roosters crowing across the farm. The soft light of dawn spread across the fields, and the air smelled fresh with the promise of a new day. He stepped outside and looked at what his farm had become. Once it had been an abandoned, broken place, and now it was alive with green fields, animals, and people working together. The farm was no longer just his, it had become part of the community. And every time he saw it, he remembered the old box in the barn, the hidden fortune that had made this new life possible. Daniel never thought of the money as something only for himself. He used it carefully, always asking if it would bring lasting good. He fixed his farmhouse, but he kept it simple. He bought tools and seeds, but never wasted. And when he saw people in need, he shared what he had. Slowly, word spread beyond the village. Travelers heard about the man who had once been nearly penniless, but who had turned his life around and was now helping others do the same. People came from nearby towns to see the farm, to buy food, or simply to feel the kindness that seemed to live in the soil. One afternoon, an old neighbor who had once mocked him walked up to the farmhouse. "I was wrong about you," the man said, his voice quiet. "I thought you'd fail, but you've given this place life again." Daniel smiled and shook his hand. "The land just needed someone to believe in it," he said softly. But deep down, he knew it was not only the land that had needed belief, it was him too. The farm became a place of gathering. Families came on weekends to buy fresh vegetables. Children ran through the fields chasing chickens and goats. Elderly neighbors sat on the porch with Daniel, sharing stories while sipping warm tea. It was as if the farm itself had been waiting for someone to unlock its hidden heart. And Daniel, the man who once had nothing but $900 and a desperate hope, had been chosen to do it. Yet Daniel never forgot the nights of hunger, the days of despair, and the weight of hopelessness. That memory kept him humble. He didn't see himself as a rich man. He saw himself as someone given a responsibility. The old letters in the box reminded him that the previous owner had once loved the land but couldn't keep it alive. Daniel felt as though he had been handed the chance to finish what that man had started. One day, Daniel invited the local children to the farm for a small harvest celebration. They helped him pick tomatoes, carry baskets of beans, and gather eggs from the chickens. Laughter filled the air as the children played, and Daniel's heart swelled with joy. He stood in the middle of the field, watching the simple happiness around him, and he realized that this was the true treasure he had discovered, not just the money, but the life and joy that had come from using it well. At sunset, he walked back into the barn alone. The box still sat in its hiding place under the floorboards, though now it was cleaner and well kept. He knelt down beside it, ran his hand across the lid, and whispered, "You saved me, and I promise I'll keep saving others." Tears filled his eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude. Daniel thought about his journey. He remembered standing in the courthouse with sweaty palms, spending his last $900 while people whispered he was a fool. He remembered the first night in the cold, broken farmhouse when he told himself at least the land was his. He remembered pulling up the floorboards and seeing the box for the first time, his heart racing with disbelief. And he remembered the moment he realized that this was not just about fortune, but about faith, work, and kindness. The farm grew stronger with each season. Crops flourished, animals multiplied, and the community found strength in working together. Daniel never kept count of how much money was left in the box. To him, what mattered was what had already been done. The broken land was alive again, the community had hope, and he himself had been lifted out of despair. That was wealth enough. Years later, when people asked Daniel how he had done it, he always smiled and said, "The land gave me more than I gave it." He never explained the box in detail, but those close to him understood there had been something extraordinary behind his story. Still, most people believed it was his hard work and faith that had changed everything. And in truth, they were right. The fortune had helped, but without his courage to risk everything on that one last chance, he never would have discovered it. Daniel often stood at the edge of his fields at sunrise, looking out at the rows of crops swaying gently in the morning breeze. He would close his eyes and whisper, "Thank you." He thanked the land, the man who had hidden the fortune, and life itself for giving him another chance. Each time he did, he felt the same tears rising, the same tears that had first come when he opened the box in the barn. One evening, as the golden sun painted the sky, Daniel invited his neighbors to a gathering. They shared food, laughter, and music under the open sky. Standing among them, Daniel realized he was no longer the lonely man who had been pushed to the edge of despair. He was part of a family, part of a story larger than himself. The farm had given him a new life, and in return he had given it back to the people around him. As the night grew quiet and the stars came out, Daniel walked once more into the barn. He stood over the place where the fortune still rested, hidden beneath the floor. He placed his hand gently on the wood, closed his eyes, and let the tears fall freely. They were not tears of sorrow, but of deep gratitude, the kind that come when a man knows he has been blessed beyond measure. Daniel had bought the farm with his last $900. People had laughed, doubted, and even pitied him. But now the farm stood alive and strong, a symbol of faith, work, and hidden miracles. And though the box had brought him wealth, it was the journey that had brought him meaning. Standing in the barn with tears streaming down his face, Daniel finally understood. The hidden fortune had not only saved his life, it had given him the chance to live a life worth remembering.